All right, everybody. So this is part of our animator interview kind of series we're doing here. And I have Tom Schroder. He you still did you still animate or are you
Yeah,
still-
I mean, I
okay.
am not really taking. I get offered little projects occasionally, but I'm retired from teaching, and I'm just
Okay.
primarily spending my time on my independent
On your
work now.
personal work.
Yeah.
Okay, so he's still animating, was a teacher for many years, has done both commercial and kind of, independent work and kind of done the festival circuit, including you won an agency NSE award in 2013, right?
Oh, yeah. I guess that's
He's
true. Yeah.
the For
The
those of you who
Marcel.
don't know, that's kind of like the European version of, or I don't know. It's a high animation award. I don't know where it fits in the category of things, but so Tom, as I always kind of start off with people about this, right? Where does your love of animation come from? Where does it start?
Um, my background isn't in fine arts. I went to school for English literature in the early 1980s, and when I graduated from college, I, did a few. I was writing short stories and things, but I was always interested in filmmaking, and it was I met an animator from New York who had moved to Minneapolis, where I was living and continued to live. Her name was Allison Morse, is Allison Morse. She still lives here. And I kind of saw what she was doing, and she opened my eyes to this whole world of independent animation that I hadn't been exposed to on the Bugs Bunny and Tom and Jerry cartoons I'd watched on television as a kid was my idea of animation. But I was starting to see films by the Hubleys and the New York independents of the 70s, like George Griffin and those folks.
Huh.
And
I actually interviewed him in one of the other interviews.
oh, that's great. Yeah, because Allison had worked on a couple of George's films in New York when she lived there, and then she moved here. And so I kind of apprenticed myself to her working on her projects, both kind of commissioned projects and her independent films. And it was that apprentice mentor, that old-fashioned way of learning where it wasn't a formal program, but I was learning from her just by working on her stuff. And then I started to get my foot in the door of the commercial houses in town at that time, which were all 2D at that time, late 80s, early
Sure.
90s, pre-digital era or just dawning digital era as relates to animation. There was a company called RealWorks where I worked, and an animator named Gavrilo Ganatovich, who had a company called Gav Productions. He's in Cleveland now, I think, or he might be even in Arizona. He's bounced around a couple times. So I started doing work on Alka-Seltzer nighttime cold medicine commercials, 30-second spots, just,
Right.
doing rendering and in-betweening and stuff, but learning the ropes in practice. And so that was really kind of where I started to become interested in both aspects of animation of like, oh, you could potentially make a living doing this. And oh, wow, this is a really creative art form, especially in the independent world, the short films that
Sure.
I'm starting to see. I was really excited by the storytelling possibilities.
So sorry, just to clarify. So you started doing the commercial work and then you did your own independent, or did you do your independent stuff first and then kind of get some paying gigs or
No, I mean, because I really had no experience whatsoever, working with Allison just naturally led to the lowest rung of
right.
basically cell painting at that time.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I basically got my foot in the door doing the most elemental kind of stuff. And then I was very disciplined and interested and worked hard. So they kept, giving me harder jobs than I was learning in the process. But it was kind of happening simultaneously, David. It was like
Got it.
I was learning from Allison working on her projects. I was starting to do the commercial stuff to make some money. And then I thought, well, I'm going to make my own films too. And then I started to very laboriously make independent films.
So let's start a little bit on the contract side, just because I think some students would want to hear a little bit about that. What's that process like? I mean, obviously technology's changed a lot since the 80s, but like from just a sort of pipeline production, when you were working on these commercial spots for 30 seconds, what was like kind of the process? What was the time period? How long did you have? I've
Yeah.
talked to a couple other people who do not so much commercials, but kind of short animation where it's like there's a 3 months process, and they're like, you come in, you do this, you lock down the storyboard. And so what was it like for you at that time,
Yeah.
roughly? Yeah.
So we're talking about schedules being longer at this period of time because everything is being all the assets are being generated physically. So
Sure.
everything is drawn and rendered on physical materials with physical art materials, often painted to cells, shot underneath a 35 millimeter camera, multiple cell layers. It's a 30-second spot, but it's still a maybe 5 week to 6 week schedule for that.
Mhm.
And so I'm coming in, the way I would work as a subcontractor at that period of time that we mentioned is I would come in after the storyboarding's been done, everything's gotten through the agency, the first hoops have been cleared. And then I'm just starting to do either if I'm in betweening, I'm working with the lead animator and I'm in betweening shots, or if I'm rendering, maybe it's a colored pencil on
Mhm.
some kind of blue construction paperwork.
Excuse me.
I'm just rendering frame by frame. Cell painting is really just kind of it's well, I don't know. I don't even know if cell painting even means anything to students these days.
Right, right.
It's basically like the bucket tool in Photoshop.
Yeah, yeah.
It's just
You
like
use gouache. I did. My first animation class at RISD was in 2000, and they had us do paint cells. And I think
yeah,
I had to paint. I did a kangaroo jumping, and I think it was 12 cells, including like drawing and painting. And I think it took me like 20 hours to make like half a second of animation. It was just it's a long process for sure.
yeah. I mean, in some ways, if I think about it, like what happened with the digital tools as they evolved is they sped certain things up, but in essence, the process is very similar. I mean, there's a
Sure.
storyboard stage, there's an animating stage, like a rough stage, there's cleanup, there's in betweening, even working with the Cintiq, and then compositing is where things really get sped up if you're using After Effects as opposed to shooting under a film camera on uh, uh, a stand.
Right.
You have a lot more flexibility in that post-production stage after the animation has been
Were
created.
you part of the sort of story writing storyboard, or is that someone else and they sort of pass it on to you?
No,
Or
no, no, no. At that
okay.
time, at that first stage, I was later when I was doing commercials, when I was directing commercials that were based on the styles of my films, and I
Mhm.
can talk about how that came about.
Sure.
Then I'm involved in every aspect of it. I'm
Okay.
I'm I'm doing the storyboarding. I'm basically
Right, right.
the one who's getting the approvals at every stage of it, and I'm hiring subcontractors to work for me
Sure.
to do things on schedule.
So just so my students have an idea, back then, to do the 30-second commercial spot, how long was your studio start to finish? How long was it taking, give or take?
I mean, I honestly don't know about all of the pre-production stuff
Okay.
that occurred before I got there, but based on my experience in the early 2000s, when I was still doing things I was using digital tools, but I was still doing things in a pretty old-fashioned kind of 2D
Mhm.
animating way. A 30-second spot that I would do for Kashi would be a 5 week schedule at that
Fine.
time.
Okay.
5 weeks. And I was thinking that I'm probably that when I'm just going to say Alka-Seltzer nighttime cold medicine because
Sure,
I've
sure.
said it already, but there was one commercial that I worked on in the late 80s, sheep jumping over the Alka-Seltzer nighttime cold medicine box of someone trying to fall asleep. Um, those were probably about 5 week schedules,
Five
and the
weeks.
part that I was involved in would have been the last 2 to 3 weeks of that, of just rendering all the stuff before it gets shot.
Got it, got it. So you actually kind of started in the deep end by actually working on some commercial work.
Mhm.
You don't have a formal training, like you didn't go to
Yeah,
school or
it
anything.
it seems kind of improbable in with no background, with no sort of portfolio or
Right.
reel, just walk into a studio and say, "Hey, can I paint cells?" And they'd
My
say,
friend Arnie kind of started the same way. Like he would say he just would go to LA and people would be like, "Hey," and he
"Yeah,
made his business. Basically, he made his business by always meeting deadlines. He's like, the most
yeah,
important thing was knowing, being part of the circle of people. I mean, this is the 70s and the 80s
yeah,
too. It's like there's no internet, so everyone sort of you get stuff by knowing someone, but also being like, people know that if they hired him, he does good work, he does it on time, that sort of thing. So,
Well, I mean, and as a teacher, I would always talk about the importance of what you just said. Like even very early on, I understood the responsibility of showing up, being nice to everybody around you,
right,
being
right,
respectful, being responsible, and then also, I just wanted to put. I was curious, and I wanted to put in as much time beyond what I was getting paid for to learn. So I
right,
would
right.
just say, "Can I have some materials and give me some exercises? Give me some in
Sure,
between
sure.
exercises so I can improve my skills." So if you have an eagerness and a kind of discipline and a mentality, and you're pretty easygoing, I mean, and they want to have you around, you can
Right.
you can start to make those connections. And the way that it happened for me is one studio, like say Gav Ganatovich
Mhm.
would ask RealWorks, "Hey, I've got this diabetes public service announcement thing that I'm doing. Can you recommend any of the subcontractors that you've been working on?" So it's clearly
Right.
like a networking thing, the way that it's
Yeah,
always worked. It's like relationships with people, one thing leads to another, and you eventually build up your connections. And the more connections you have, the more often you work.
right. So, let's kind of, so you start at the same time doing commercial, but also kind of, learning about sort of non-traditional, indie animation,
Mm,
not necessarily like a Warner Brothers, Disney, Fleischer Studio type thing.
right.
So when do you start doing kind of your own work, and what kind of is inspiring you to do your own work?
Yeah, I mean, the things that are inspiring me to do my own work are, one of it's just seeing certain films that really excite me, the possibilities of which really excite me. I remember seeing Norman McLaren's scratch and paint on directly on celluloid films from the late 40s and 50s. He was doing it
Right.
early, these abstract films of basically what you might call visual music these days, or visualizers. So it would be like
Sure.
creating a visual
Yeah,
interpretation
yeah.
of a musical track. So I would see some of his films, and that purely abstract thing really excited me because I'd never seen that. So I just started doing some experiments with a Super 8 camera, just
Mm.
doing some more abstract things. And then after a short period of that, I decided I wanted to do a more narrative film. And then
Mhm.
that took about 18 months, 5,000 whatever drawings and cell paintings. And then I made a couple films until in the late 90s, I made one film that started to, I had some, festival play with the first couple films that I made, but then a film that I made called Bike Ride, which is the style that the Kashi commercials were based on, that started to play at Sundance, Annecy, the bigger
Okay.
festivals.
Yeah, yeah.
And then when you suddenly have access to distributors and agents,
Right.
people
Right.
who are like, "Hey, that style's really cool. Maybe I can do something with that." Um, so it was on the basis, I think it was my third film, it could have been my fourth film, the bike ride film, that at those bigger festivals, there was a guy from the Klasky Chupo studio. I think it was
Mhm.
at the Ottawa Festival, or it could have been at Sundance. His name was John Andrews, and he was running the commercial division at the Klasky Chupo studio called Kachu. And it was kind of in
Mhm.
the heyday of the Rugrats, sort of the end of that
Yeah,
period.
yeah.
The studio was getting a little derelict on Hollywood
Okay.
Boulevard. There was like one floor that was completely empty, but it was still running, and I did some commercials through them. But basically, the way it works for an independent animator is you have a film that does, a certain amount of, it gets a certain amount of visibility, usually at festivals at that period of time. It could be online now.
Right.
And somebody contacts you and said, "Hey, do you want to be repped for commercials? Do you want me to rep you for commercials?" And you sign a contract and they get a percentage of your director fee, and
Yeah.
they hopefully get you gigs in the style that you've created. Um, and I'll
Sorry to
just,
interrupt you just really quick. I interviewed the guy, I don't know if you've heard of Doomlands. It was a cartoon done for the Roku channel. Actually, sorry, it was done for Quibi,
did you
which
say Dreamlands?
Doomlands.
Doomlands?
So it was there was a service that died many years ago. It's called Quibi. It was kind of, so anyway, he got his kind of like what you were saying. Like basically, I was asking how, he was explaining his process. He had made like a basic, I don't know if you know what Kickstarter is, but
Yeah.
Kickstarter's, so he had made like a short demo for Kickstarter to have, people, and then that's where Quibi, you know, found him and said, "Hey, we'll give you the money to, produce it." And then maybe died and got bought by Roku channel, but it's a whole, but anyway, yeah. So it's kind of the same thing where it's like what you're saying, where you got visibility from going to these festivals, and that kind of like led to other things, and people
Yeah.
want to, give you money and to let you, to explore your style with them and that kind of thing.
Well, no, that's not
Sure.
entirely true.
Oh,
I
sorry.
mean, some of that happens. I mean, well, okay, let's to separate things. So you make a film. My way of thinking about it is you create a market for your individuality because you made an independent film that doesn't look like other things,
Sure.
and art directors in the agencies might see your film if your rep shows it to them, and they'll say, "Oh yeah, we could maybe sell tires or toilet paper or
Sure, sure.
breakfast cereal with this style." Um, so what you're doing is you're doing your style, but it's not to explore the creative possibilities of your style.
Well,
It's
yeah,
a whole product,
yeah.
and that name of that product is stamped all over it.
Sure.
That though you do get a lot of interesting experience of working with hard criticism, working with deadlines,
Right.
working with a fair amount of money that can be intimidating when you first start doing it. And then also you do, I found that when I was doing commercials, I would come up with little innovations technically in the process of doing it that would then work their way back into my independent work. So it was
Okay.
a self-perpetuating and self-feeding
Right.
cycle. But independent animators often support themselves on the side with commercial work. People
Sure.
like, I mean, people have sort of franchises. I remember Joanna Quinn. Is that a name that's familiar to you? She's a
Yeah,
British,
I'm familiar with your work.
yeah,
Yeah.
she British animator. Girls' Night Out was one of her first big films. Britannia. She was doing like I forget the brand of toilet paper, Charmin or something, but there was a cute little bear that was her
Right.
creation. And she had, I mean, she made a fortune off of doing those commercials because it just kept going and going and going.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
so you can make a lot of money, but it's not if your disposition is sort of fine art related or you really want to spend your time making your own work, the
Sure.
commercials can be a frustrating thing to juggle with your time as well.
Well, that kind of leads me, I mean, since you sort of have seen it from both sides of both worlds, what are some pros and cons of both? Like, what's the pro and con of doing commercial, and what's kind of the pro and con of doing your own work, would you say, from your experience?
Yeah. I mean, the pros of doing your own work are that you're satisfying some kind of creative and emotional and moral impulse to explore the things that interest you most in life and to try to find an innovative storytelling style or graphic style that's going to communicate those things best. So it's really an exciting process with you don't necessarily have a producer making comments or guiding you if you don't have a budget for it. If you're
Hmm.
self-financing and doing it entirely on your own, it's basically up to you and whoever you trust with feedback.
Right.
So it's completely open-ended and you have complete creative freedom, and that part can be very satisfying. The downside of that is nobody really makes a living doing it.
Right.
There are exceptions, like maybe Bill Plimpton in his day and Don
Sure.
Hertzfeldt. I think they probably have made a living from the distribution of short films,
Sure.
at least at different times, but that's very rare. I mean, it's very rare that that happens. So most people are financing. I mean, there's a lot of different ways you can do it. I mean, people just sometimes have unrelated day jobs.
Right.
I've taught animation at a school called the Minneapolis College of Art and Design for a long time. I retired a couple years ago from that, but that was really satisfying working with young people, hiring them on my projects when they graduated sometimes,
Sure.
and
Sure.
doing commercial work. In Europe, there's a little more. My European indie friends can survive for periods of time through the government funding that's available, like multiple
Right.
co-productions. A friend of mine who's unfortunately dead now, named Rosto, who's a Dutch animator who made these really Baroque, flamboyant films. He just lived entirely from making his films because he got big multinational co-production money from Belgium, France, the
Mhm.
Netherlands, Germany, sometimes to get, like a 500,000 euro budget for a
Wow.
10-minute, from which he got paid as a director for the two
Right.
years that
Right.
he made it. So he got paid basically to make the film he wanted to make. But those kinds of things are difficult for American indies. There is
Yeah.
grant funding. I live in the state of Minnesota, which is a generous grant funding state, but again, you'll never survive entirely on art grants. They can be
Right.
helpful to finance a project, but um, so that's the pros and cons, I'd say, of the indie world. The pros and cons of the commercial world are the commercial world, you basically get paid a lot of money. I mean, you did. The budgets after 2008, I found were substantially smaller, and the schedules seemed to be smaller as expectations changed. But you can still, with the right client and the right people guiding you through it, make a fair amount of money doing commercials. Um, the deadlines, the schedules, and the scrutiny or the cycles of feedback are really grueling. And sometimes you begin to feel like the art directors in these agencies won't be happy until your mental and physical health breaks down completely. There's a
Sure.
sadistic feeling. You start to like subjectively feel like they're trying to break you down, but they're just trying to get the best, work they can out of you. So it
Sure.
can be really stressful. I mean, it's a grind. Um, and but it does facilitate your learning skills. You learn to deal with people in a way that sometimes independent animators don't. You learn to collaborate with people. You do learn the skills of negotiating these kinds of
Right.
actions as well. So there's all kinds of benefits that you might see as being difficult at the time, but later you look back on it and say, well, I did learn a lot from that experience. And then
Hmm.
you walk away with a lot of money in the bank that you can either invest for the future or put into another project of your own.
Sure. Um, since you've been a teacher for a long time, I'm sure you have a set of what you think is important. What's your advice to students who are just starting out? Because my students are they've taken like one kind of intro to, animation. We've done 2D, whether it's, Adobe Animate or whatever program it is. We've done the 12 principles, things like
Yeah.
that, all the sort of standard, animation school stuff. What's your kind of advice to, and students who are interested in getting better at animation?
Yeah. I mean, uh, with my, okay, so at MCAD, I would teach an intro class like just exactly like what you've described with the Disney
Sure.
fundamentals, the 12 principles. And then I would, if someone committed after that class to becoming an animation major, I might be their advisor. There were a couple other faculty members who they might be assigned to. But if I'm sitting
Sure.
down advising a student after the intro to animation class at MCAD, I would say, I come, I've never worked in a big studio. I know that your aspiration is to work at Disney. Like you told me that when you saw Frozen or whatever it was, that changed your life and all you ever wanted to do was be a Disney animator.
Sure.
To be realistic, it's going to be tough. There's a lot of competition. They're not recruiting from the Minneapolis College of Art and Design
Right.
directly. So you're going to
Sure.
have to be really good and you're probably going to have to be very specialized and you're going to have to show that specialization on your reel.
Right.
I want to have a slick and professional looking reel. If they're more into the creative indie end of things that I'm in, I tell them, now your job is to create of something very unique and individual. It's like you explore your technical, develop your technical skills, but now your job is to create ingenuity and innovation. And that's the way that you're going to create a market for what you do. That's the way it's worked with me. That's the way it's worked
Sure.
with my friends. You need to do something that, startles people or looks really different from what
Right.
somebody has done or develops a really interesting way of telling a story with split screens or four screens or whatever it might be. But
Right.
you need to start to develop your idiosyncrasies, whatever it is that your special skills are, and it's about technical virtuosity, but it's also about developing a kind of uniqueness of sensibility. So it'd
Sure.
be like, which category do you think you fall more into? Do you really want to work on big commercial projects?
Right. Right.
Then figure out it's going to be 3D now, probably. Figure
Probably.
out if you're a modeler, figure out if you're an animator, figure out what your role in that pipeline is going to be, and then start to develop those skills very specifically.
Sure. Yeah, you touched on something. I mean, this is not specifically animation, but I went to art school, and they always kind of say like you sort of develop your style. Like
Yeah.
I go to an art museum, I know if I see you can always even if it doesn't say it, like I know a Picasso from a Monet, I know a Monet from a Jackson Pollock. I mean, obviously their styles are dramatically different, but even there's like I have a friend who's a professional painter, and I can always tell his work, even because he just has a certain style, certain brushstrokes, certain color choices, certain subject matter. And
Yeah.
it kind of, brands you. I hate, I don't want to get too commercially, but like, it brands you as like, okay, this is their style. This is what they do. Billy Plimpton has a style.
Yeah,
Don
for sure.
Hertzfeldt has a style, like I can look at a Billy Plimpton. I'm like, that's probably a Billy Plimpton, or at least someone drawing in a Billy Plimpton style if it's not
Yeah.
his, you know. And it's kind of like, the same way, like this sort of artistic, whatever kind of, whatever sense of, whatever style kind of defines you and is unique, like you were talking about.
Yeah, I mean, there is that, but there's also the ability to reinvent yourself as well and
Sure, sure.
continue to expand upon your style. Some people are better at that than others. The thing you mentioned too was something I always noticed when I was teaching. It wasn't hard to notice, but if someone came in with an extremely strong influence, of course it was anime at a certain period, or when you
Right.
said Don
I'd say
Hertzfeldt,
it still is, for at least for my
yeah, it seems
students.
to be the enduring thing that you try to like guide them away from a little bit or,
Sure.
develop from. But Don Hertzfeldt, I think it was around what was it, Billy's Balloon, that film?
Yeah, that was like early 2000s, mid 2000s.
Early, yeah.
I
That
was in
film,
college at that point, but so I would have been like 2003, 4-ish, give or
yeah.
take.
But after that film, my students saw it everywhere
Right.
and they just started drawing Don Hertzfeldt. And I was
Sure.
like, okay, Don Hertzfeldt is great, but you don't want to draw Don Hertzfeldt. I mean, it's like you want to work on your own thing.
Sure.
It really looks like a Don Hertzfeldt knockoff, and you should shy away from that a little bit or work
Right,
toward
right.
something else.
Yeah, no, that's something I always try to encourage my students to have like their own style. And, I have a friend of mine who's a painter and he teaches painting. And it's funny because he has the same thing. Like a lot of his students are, they're not trying to be professional painters. They're just doing it for fun. And they'll take like a Monet or whatever and copy it. And
Mhm.
he's always trying to get them to have their own style. And it's like we've had this debate just artistically. It's like it's hard to teach someone to be creative.
Yeah.
Like I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's like I don't know. It's like it's hard to be like, no, no, you have to come up with what you want to do, not necessarily.
Yeah.
I mean, there's nothing wrong. I think there's benefits to mimicking other people's work because you kind of like practice. And so I'm not saying there's no skill or there's no learning from it, but it's like it's
Yeah.
hard. Eventually, at some point, it's good to sort of it's develop your own and have your own style and try to creatively think what's important to you and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. But you're right that there is a stage that everybody goes through of mimicry that's important. And like to be able to reproduce something is a skill in of itself, and that's a
Sure,
step towards something. But we all have our influences. I think maybe when you say it's hard to teach creativity, as a teacher, if you ask yourself the question, like, where did it start for me? It really was like being exposed to more of the history of animation that
sure.
isn't readily available, like maybe other national traditions like Eastern European animation, which tends to
Right.
be not very optimistic and
Yes.
looks very different
More
than
political too,
more
yeah.
political, doesn't look like a Bugs Bunny cartoon
Right.
necessarily. So there's national traditions that just come out of a cultural sensibility that you know nothing about. Um,
Right.
so I mean, I found that just try to give my students the broadest possible historical perspective was always really important because for me, that was how I got excited about animation in its full diversity. And it's easier now with the internet than it was when
Sure.
I was. Um,
So where do you kind of see animation going from your perspective and your long history with it?
yeah. Um, where it went while I was teaching, it went through a lot of phases just to think about the interests of my students. By the time I stopped teaching, one of the reasons that I stopped was because so much was about gaming at that point, and
Sure.
my sensibility didn't come from gaming.
Sure,
I
sure.
was more of a linear storytelling type of person, so
Right.
developing loops as assets into this kind of
Right.
scenario and everything. And then the tools like the Unity
Sure.
tool that they were using and a lot of 3D animation. These are not tool sets that I'm comfortable with. I was
Sure.
became a little conversant in it to be able to talk to people about their senior projects, but I wasn't teaching that stuff.
Sure, sure.
So in that regard, the way that animation has broadened out into, I mean, as the technology has developed, the way that it's broadened out into gaming and virtual reality and those kinds of more, I would say, setting based, or there is narrative in games, obviously, but it's
Sure.
more like you're navigating an environment and a set of problem solving or
It's interactive. It's interactive storytelling.
yeah. And so that was obviously a big development through the evolution of the technology in the first decades that I was teaching.
Mhm.
Now I would say that, I've started to experiment a little bit with the Photoshop beta generative AI. And as that starts to apply itself to animation purposes, a lot of people are
Right.
worried about, our jobs disappearing. But I
Sure.
actually see it as having possibilities in terms of the huge labor intensive aspect of animation of generating the assets. I mean, as AI develops, it could be doing the least interesting parts of the jobs to free up more creativity. And
Right.
who knows, like the scale of what independent animators are able to do might expand, where they're able to be more of the director than the assembly line worker on all of generating
Sure.
of the assets. So who knows what's going to happen with that? But
Right.
there's a lot of ethical concerns with where AI is getting its imagery and all too, and
That's a
what's
whole
not.
other story about copyright, but yeah.
Yeah. But honestly, it seems exciting to me, even though I won't be a part of tech, I won't technologically or technically be a
Right.
part of. I'm still kind of making traditional little, short narrative films. Um, and I'm not going to get into gaming or interactive
Sure.
media in that sense. But it does seem exciting to me that it continues to reinvent itself, and the enthusiasm of whatever the next generation is doing with it is always taking it in a different direction. But I have no idea, honestly, where it's going to go, which is why I kind of stopped teaching because I thought I'm not really conversing with this anymore. I'm not as relevant as I need to be to the students'
Sure.
expectation. It's time for a
Well,
younger.
yeah, I mean, it's hard. I mean, I always kind of feel personally that like, and I always tell my students, it's like the technology will always change. I mean, what people were
Yeah,
using in the 20s versus when you were doing it versus now. I mean, obviously, all of that, like the literal technology has changed, so the pipeline changes.
yeah,
But I mean, any Pixar movie, even if technologically, it was weak, Toy Story is still a good story,
yeah, yeah,
still well animated.
yeah,
And so, like, when I talk to my students, it's like, yeah, the 12 principles were written in the 40s, but they can still apply now. I mean, like, yes, they weren't
yeah.
doing 3D, obviously, because people weren't using computers at that point for graphics, but it doesn't matter because you're still applying the ideas, you're just putting them in a new context,
I mean, to me, the principles are acting. I mean,
Sure,
it's basically creating a convincing performance that will involve or in the character's story. And
sure,
whether it's 3D, whether it's a video game, if it's hand drawn, if it's
sure,
cutout animation, all of that stuff, anticipation, squash and stretch, all those things are
sure.
about the performance of your character and creating something that communicates.
Yeah, and that's also why, like, at least for me, I've been teaching 15 and I've watched technology change, over the last 15 years, even. I mean, now we're into AI, which is a whole other area. But it's like I moved over from art, fine art, but it wasn't hard because it's like, yes, I did not specifically learn like Photoshop or, graphic design, but it's like I learned how colors work. I learned how, like general like shape and volume, like all the principles of design and art. And it's like you can just apply them in a new way, like the idea of color theory works in animation in the same way it works in a painting, in the same way it works in an advertisement for Crest toothpaste or whatever. It's like how you decide to apply it is your own kind of whatever. But the concepts, design concepts, art concepts, animation concepts, concepts of motion design, whether it's stop motion stuff in the 70s or, video games or now VR, it's like they all apply. This is the literal like minutia technology might change, obviously, and that's always going to happen. But the core concepts, to me, they're like math. Like they don't change. Like you can apply them in different ways, but they still remain. If that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think like with everything that we're talking about, like you said with the Pixar films, it's ultimately about creating an emotional experience. My
Right.
things fell out here. My glasses are bad. It's about creating an emotional experience, which is just the same kind of storytelling that we all grew up with. I mean, it's like
Sure.
you want to feel like this connection to life and the world and this sense of adventure, of possibility. And it's always that elemental human desire is always going to be part of what everybody's doing with whatever technology is, current.
Sure. All right. Well, do you have any parting words for my students?
Um,
It's okay if
yeah,
you don't have any.
yeah, yeah,
Keep
yeah.
this
I
moderate.
mean, I always, the thing that I always told my students was in terms of their expectations, because when you're young, often your expectations are a little bit unrealistic for the way that the world works. Like you want to think big, and it's good to be ambitious, and you want to work for Disney, or you want to
Right.
whatever it is that you've seen. But my motto when I was teaching was always know what's enough. It's like take one step at a time, um, establish something, some desire to be challenged, both technically and in terms of the environments that you're willing to put yourself in to learn. Be patient. But knowing what's enough for me was a big deal because I started with unrealistic expectations like everybody else. I thought
Sure.
just going to make my short films that people were going to pay me to do that and that was going to be my life. And then I learned that wasn't going to be the case. And then you shift but you realize enough doors are opening along the way for you that you're having this good life and that the good life is, somewhat more modest than you expected it to be, but it's
Sure.
pretty satisfying. And you develop your practice and it feeds you and your relationships feed you and it all works out in the end if you're patient.
Sure. Well, that's a good spot to leave off on. So I want to thank you for spending your time and imparting us with your experience. I'm sure the students got a lot from it. And yeah, thank you very much.
Okay. Nice to meet you, David.